The high-pitched whine of my table saw cutting through quarter-sawn maple suddenly stopped. Not because I was done shaping the soundboard for what would become a custom dreadnought acoustic guitar, but because someone was pounding on my workshop door like they were trying to break it down. I pulled off my safety glasses and heard my name being shouted through the basement walls. The smell of fresh wood shavings and Danish oil hung in the air like incense, but the voice cutting through my sanctuary carried the sharp edge of authority that made my stomach drop. When I opened the door, Constance Fairchild stood there in her perfectly pressed tennis outfit, holding an official-looking document like it was a weapon. Her manicured nails drummed against the paper as she smiled that predatory smile I'd learned to recognize over the past month. "Mr. Kimberly," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness, "I have something you need to see." What she didn't know was that in about 6 months, that same piece of paper would become evidence in a federal fraud case that would bring down her entire $8 million empire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we dive into this wild ride, I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that seemed more interested in power trips than helping the community? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm curious if these kinds of conflicts happen everywhere, or if Nashville just attracts a special kind of crazy. My name is Jared Kimberly, and up until 3 years ago, I was living what most people would call the dream. I was a senior acoustic engineer at one of Nashville's premier recording studios, working with artists whose names you definitely recognize. The pay was incredible, the work was meaningful, and I got to be part of creating music that touched millions of people. Then everything changed in about 2 seconds. I was setting up microphones for a particularly loud rock session when a massive feedback loop hit. The sound engineer's board malfunctioned, and instead of the smooth 85 decibels we were aiming for, we got hit with a spike that topped 140 decibels. For context, that's louder than a gunshot at close range. The ringing in my left ear didn't stop after an hour like it usually did. It didn't stop after a day. 3 weeks later, an audiologist confirmed what I already knew. I'd lost about 60% of my hearing in that ear, with permanent tinnitus that sounded like a smoke detector battery running low. You might think losing hearing in one ear wouldn't matter much for an audio engineer, but you'd be wrong. Stereo imaging, spatial awareness, phase detection, all the subtle skills that made me good at my job required both ears working in perfect harmony. I tried to adapt, but after 6 months of struggling to do what used to be second nature, I knew it was time for a career change. That's when I remembered my grandfather's workshop. See, my dad's father was a violin maker back in the old country before he immigrated here in the 1950s. He spent my childhood teaching me how to feel the grain in wood, how different species resonated, how the curve of a sound hole could make or break an instrument's voice. After he passed when I was 15, I thought those skills would just be a nice memory. But when traditional audio engineering became impossible, I realized I could still create music, just in a different way. I spent my savings converting my basement into a proper lutherie workshop. Climate control systems to maintain 45% humidity year-round. Dust collection that would make a furniture factory jealous. Hand tools that cost more than most people's cars. Because when you're crafting instruments that sell for $15,000 to $30,000, precision isn't optional. The transition wasn't easy. Learning to build acoustic guitars from scratch is like learning surgery. One wrong cut can destroy months of work. But gradually, word got around Nashville's music scene that there was this guy who understood sound from an engineering perspective and could translate that into wood and wire. My first big break came when a session player brought me a 1960s Martin that had been damaged in a tour bus accident. The repair work I did impressed him so much that he commissioned a custom instrument. Then that player recommended me to a producer. The producer told a studio owner. Within 18 months, I had a 6-month waiting list and customers flying in from Los Angeles and New York just to see my work. I wasn't getting rich, but I was making enough to live comfortably while doing something that felt meaningful again. Each guitar I built carried a piece of my grandfather's legacy. I'd taken to carving his initials into a hidden spot inside the sound chamber, a tradition he'd started with his violins. Life was good. I was healing, both financially and emotionally. That's when I moved to Harmony Estates. The neighborhood seemed perfect for someone in my position. It was an upscale community about 20 minutes outside Nashville's core, populated mostly by people in the music industry. Producers, session musicians, even a few artists you'd recognize, lived within a few blocks of my new place. The house itself was ideal, a 1990s split level with a full basement that had clearly been designed as a workshop space by the previous owner. The HOA paperwork mentioned reasonable home-based businesses were permitted, and the real estate agent assured me that several neighbors ran music-related operations out of their homes. For the first few months, everything was perfect. I transformed the basement into something that looked like a cross between a laboratory and an art studio. Humidity sensors, air filtration, hand tools arranged with surgical precision. The acoustic properties down there were incredible. Thick concrete walls meant I could test instruments without bothering anyone. My first indication that trouble was brewing came in the form of Constance Fairchild herself. She showed up one afternoon in late September, ostensibly to welcome me to the neighborhood. Constance was one of those women who wore wealth like armor, perfectly highlighted hair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, tennis clothes that had clearly never seen an actual tennis court, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I hear you're some kind of craftsman," she said, looking around my living room like she was taking inventory. "How interesting." When I mentioned that I built custom acoustic guitars, her demeanor shifted slightly. She suddenly became very interested in exactly what kind of equipment I used, how many instruments I produced per month, and whether I had any commercial relationships with music stores. At the time, I thought she was just being neighborly, maybe even fishing for a deal on a custom instrument. I showed her some photos of my work, mentioned a few of the artists who'd commissioned pieces. She seemed impressed, asked a lot of technical questions about wood selection and acoustic properties. "You know," she said as she was leaving, "I actually own several music stores around the region. Fairchild Music. Maybe we could discuss some kind of partnership down the road." I'd heard of Fairchild Music. They specialized in vintage and high-end instruments with locations in Nashville, Memphis, and Atlanta, the kind of places where collectors dropped $50,000 on a pre-war Martin or a 1950s Gibson without blinking. "That could be interesting," I told her. "I'm always looking for ways to connect with serious collectors." The smile she gave me in response should have been my first warning. It was the kind of smile a shark gives just before it attacks. 2 weeks later, I got my first HOA violation notice. The complaint was for excessive noise during prohibited hours and operating a commercial workshop in a residential zone. The fine was $400, with additional penalties of $100 per day until the violation was corrected. I read the notice 3 times, trying to figure out what I was being accused of. The noise complaint claimed I was running power tools before 7 a.m. and after 9 p.m., which was completely false. I'm naturally an early riser, but I never started work before 8 a.m. out of respect for my neighbors, and I usually wrapped up by 6 p.m. because that's when my hearing tends to get fatigued anyway. The commercial workshop accusation was more troubling. According to the HOA covenant I'd received when I bought the house, home-based businesses were explicitly allowed as long as they didn't create traffic problems or noise issues. I had maybe 1 client visit per week, and most of my business was conducted through shipping. I called the HOA office and got transferred to Constance's voicemail. When she called back the next day, her tone was completely different from our friendly first meeting. "Mr. Kimberly, I'm afraid there have been multiple complaints about your activities. The Architectural Review Committee has determined that your workshop constitutes a commercial manufacturing facility, which violates Section 12 of our community standards." "But the covenant specifically allows home businesses," I said. I checked before I moved in. "Home businesses, yes, not manufacturing operations. The volume of equipment you have, the industrial nature of the work, that crosses the line into commercial activity." Here's what most people don't know about HOA covenants. They're written deliberately vague, so they can be interpreted however the board wants. Terms like reasonable, excessive, and commercial aren't defined, which gives them basically unlimited power to decide what those words mean. "What exactly would I need to do to be in compliance?" I asked. "Well, you'd need to remove all the power tools, the dust collection system, anything that could be considered manufacturing equipment. Basically, you could do small repairs by hand, but no actual instrument building." The bottom line was clear. She wanted me to shut down my workshop entirely. "I need to think about this," I told her. "Of course, but please understand that the fines continue to accumulate until the violation is corrected. We're at $800 now." After hanging up, I did what any rational person would do. I researched the hell out of my situation. I spent the next week digging through HOA law, Tennessee property rights, and the specific covenant language for Harmony Estates. What I found was interesting. The covenant did allow home businesses, but it also gave the Architectural Review Committee broad discretion to determine what constituted excessive commercial activity. However, there was a catch. Any decision by the ARC had to be reasonable and applied consistently. If they were allowing other residents to run businesses out of their homes, they couldn't single me out unless there was a legitimate difference in the nature of the operations. So I started asking around the neighborhood. Turns out there were at least 6 other home-based businesses operating in Harmony Estates. A music producer had a full recording studio in his garage. A graphic designer ran a print shop out of her basement. Someone 2 streets over was running what was essentially a small music venue, hosting private concerts twice a month. None of them had ever received violation notices. When I called Constance back with this information, she was ready for me. "Those are different situations entirely," she said. Recording studios don't involve heavy machinery. Print shops are quiet operations. You're running power tools that can be heard from the street. I've measured the noise levels at my property line, I said. Even my loudest equipment doesn't exceed 50 decibels at the boundary, which is quieter than normal conversation. Nevertheless, the committee has made its decision. You have until the end of the month to come into compliance. That's when I realized this wasn't really about noise or commercial activity. There was something else going on here. I started paying closer attention to Constance's business operations. Fairchild Music had an impressive online presence specializing in what they called authenticated vintage instruments. Their website featured dozens of guitars, banjos, and mandolins from the 1930s through 1960s, all priced in the range where serious collectors played. The descriptions were incredibly detailed. Specific years, factory information, provenance stories about original owners. Many came with certificates of authenticity and detailed histories. For someone like me who understood both the technical and historical aspects of these instruments, the inventory was fascinating to browse. But something was nagging at me. The sheer volume of inventory seemed unusual for vintage instruments. Pre-war Martins and Gibsons from the Depression era weren't exactly common. Most of the factories during that period were producing maybe a few hundred instruments per year, and the survival rate wasn't great. Yet Fairchild Music seemed to have an endless supply of instruments from exactly the most collectible periods. Their inventory turnover was impressive, too. Items that sold would be replaced within weeks by similar pieces from the same eras. Meanwhile, the HOA pressure was escalating. The fines had reached $200 when I received the second violation notice. This one was for improper storage of hazardous materials and cited my collection of wood finishes, solvents, and adhesives. Apparently, keeping Danish oil and lacquer thinner in my workshop constituted a fire hazard that required special permits. The notice gave me 48 hours to remove all hazardous materials from the premises or face additional fines of $200 per day. Now, anyone who works with wood knows that finishing materials are essential to the craft. You can't build quality furniture or instruments without proper finishes and solvents. The amounts I kept on hand were minimal, maybe a gallon total of various materials, all stored according to manufacturer specifications in a ventilated area. But here's another thing. Most people don't know HOAs can essentially redefine what constitutes hazardous materials, however they want. The list can include everything from paint thinner to fertilizer to propane tanks for grills. I called for an inspection by the county fire marshal, figuring I'd get an official ruling on whether my storage practices were actually dangerous. The inspector showed up 2 days later, spent about 20 minutes in my workshop, and pronounced everything completely within code. Whoever filed this complaint doesn't know what they're talking about, he told me. I've seen commercial shops with way more materials stored in worse conditions. You're actually being pretty conservative here. I sent a copy of the fire marshal's report to the HOA office, along with a formal request to withdraw the violation notice. Constance's response was swift and predictable. The fire marshal's opinion didn't matter, because HOA covenants could set stricter standards than local codes. The violation stood, and the fines continued accumulating. By this point, I was facing nearly $2,000 in penalties, and the clear threat that they'd keep escalating until I gave up and moved away. The stress was affecting my work, my sleep, and frankly, my mental health. The workshop that had been my sanctuary was starting to feel like a liability. That's when the anonymous complaints started. Someone, and I had a pretty good idea who, had apparently contacted OSHA about dangerous woodworking practices in a residential area. I came home one afternoon to find a federal inspector waiting in my driveway, armed with a clipboard and a very serious expression. The OSHA inspection was thorough and invasive. They tested air quality, measured noise levels, examined my safety equipment, and reviewed my material safety data sheets. The inspector spent 3 hours going through every detail of my operation with the kind of intensity usually reserved for actual factories. In the end, they found exactly nothing wrong. My dust collection exceeded commercial standards. My safety protocols were textbook perfect. The noise levels were within residential limits even during the loudest operations. Frankly, the inspector told me as he was packing up, whoever filed this complaint was either misinformed or deliberately wasting our time. This is one of the cleanest, safest shops I've seen in a residential setting. But the damage was done. The inspection had taken most of my day, forcing me to reschedule client meetings and delay a commissioned project that was already behind schedule. More importantly, it sent a clear message that someone was willing to use federal agencies as weapons in this neighborhood dispute. The next escalation came in the form of restricted operating hours. A new violation notice arrived claiming that any power tool operation between 4 p.m. and 8 a.m. was prohibited under quiet hours. provisions that had apparently been enacted at the most recent HOA board meeting. This was particularly problematic because most of my detailed work happened in the evening when the lighting was better and the day's distractions had died down. The notice also introduced a new requirement. Any manufacturing activity now required advance approval from the Architectural Review Committee with a processing fee of $150 per month and mandatory inspections every quarter. When I showed up to the next HOA board meeting to contest these new rules, I discovered something interesting. 3 of the 5 board members seemed genuinely surprised by the restrictions being imposed on my workshop. They'd been told that there were numerous noise complaints and safety concerns, but when I presented the fire marshal's report and the OSHA findings, their expressions shifted from skeptical to confused. "Constance," said board member Janet Morrison, a retired music teacher who lived 4 houses down from me, "you said there were multiple complaints about Mr. Kimberly's operations. Can you provide specifics about who filed these complaints and what exactly they observed?" Constance shuffled through her papers with the kind of urgency that screamed deflection. The complaints were filed anonymously, as is allowed under our procedures, but the concerns are legitimate regardless of the source. "I find it hard to believe that legitimate complaints would contradict both the fire marshal and OSHA," said another board member, a guy named Tom Chen who ran a small recording studio out of his garage. "Maybe we should table these new restrictions until we can review the actual complaint documents." The tension in that room was thick enough to cut with a bandsaw. It was clear that Constance had been operating with more authority than the full board had actually granted her, and at least some of the other members were starting to realize they'd been manipulated. But Constance wasn't giving up easily. "I understand the skepticism," she said, deploying that predatory smile again, "but we have to consider the broader implications here. If we allow one resident to operate what amounts to a small factory, where does it end? Property values, insurance liability, the character of our community, these are all at stake." Here's where her argument got interesting. She started talking about commercial traffic and how my business was attracting undesirable elements to the neighborhood. She mentioned concerns about valuable instruments being transported through residential streets and the security risks that represented. That's when something clicked in my brain. See, most of my clients were either local musicians or collectors who had instruments shipped directly to their homes or offices. I maybe had one person per week actually visit my workshop, and they were usually driving the kinds of cars that fit right in with Harmony Estates' upscale demographic. But Constance was talking about my business like it was attracting some kind of criminal element. Why would she be concerned about valuable instruments unless she had specific knowledge about what kinds of values we were talking about? After the meeting, I started thinking more seriously about Constance's business model. Fairchild Music specialized in vintage instruments with price tags that started around $50,000 and went up from there. The market for instruments in that range was relatively small: serious collectors, professional musicians with major label contracts, and investment buyers who treated vintage guitars like some people treat classic cars. In a market that niche, reputation was everything. Collectors paid premium prices because they trusted the authentication process and the provenance documentation. If someone started questioning the authenticity of instruments sold through Fairchild Music, it could seriously damage the business. And here I was, a trained acoustic engineer with deep connections in Nashville's music community, running a workshop that attracted exactly the kind of experts who could spot authentication problems. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if this whole HOA conflict was less about noise complaints and more about protecting a business model that couldn't survive close scrutiny. But I needed proof, and that's where my professional network became invaluable. One of my clients was a guy named Marcus Webb, who collected pre-war Martin guitars. Marcus had been buying vintage instruments for over 20 years and had developed relationships with collectors all over the country. When I mentioned my situation with the HOA and Constance's business, he got very interested. "You know," he said, "I've bought a couple of pieces from Fairchild Music over the years, nice instruments, but there was always something that felt a little off about the paperwork." Marcus explained that authentication in the vintage guitar world was part art, part science. You looked at construction details, aging patterns, wood characteristics, and hardware that could be verified against factory records. But a lot of it came down to the trained eye of experts who'd handled hundreds of similar instruments. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "the market has gotten so hot in the last few years that there's huge pressure to find new vintage instruments. The supply of authentic pieces is basically fixed. They're not making any more 1940s Martins. But demand keeps growing. That creates opportunities for people willing to bend the rules." He offered to introduce me to some other collectors who might be willing to share their experiences with Fairchild Music. What I discovered over the next few weeks was disturbing. Several collectors had purchased instruments from Fairchild that had issues discovered later. Nothing dramatic enough to prove fraud, but enough inconsistencies to make people wonder. Wood grain that didn't quite match factory patterns from specific years. Hardware that was period correct but showed unusual wear patterns. Serial numbers that existed in factory records but attached to instruments that didn't quite match the documented specifications. The problem, explained a collector from Memphis, is that once you've spent $60,000 on a guitar, you really don't want to discover it's not what you thought you bought. Most people would rather live with suspicions than confirm they've been scammed. But here's where my engineering background became an advantage. While collectors relied primarily on visual inspection and historical knowledge, I had access to tools that could analyze wood and materials in ways that weren't available to most people in the vintage market. The breakthrough came when Marcus brought me a 1943 Martin D28 that he'd purchased from Fairchild Music 6 months earlier. "I love this guitar," he said, "and it plays beautifully, but something about the sound characteristics has been bothering me. I know that's your specialty, so I was hoping you could take a look." The instrument was gorgeous, exactly what you'd expect from a wartime Martin. The aging was perfect, the hardware looked authentic, and the paperwork included detailed provenance tracing it back to the original owner's family. But when I started doing acoustic analysis, things got interesting. Every guitar has a sonic fingerprint that's determined by the wood species, grain patterns, and aging characteristics. Using spectrum analysis equipment I'd acquired during my studio engineering days, I could measure how different frequencies resonated through the instrument's body and identify characteristics that were specific to particular wood types and ages. The Martin that Marcus brought me sounded beautiful, but the frequency response patterns didn't match what I would expect from wood that had been aging for 80 years. I decided to do some additional testing. Using a small fiber optic camera, I examined the interior construction without damaging the instrument. What I found inside was conclusive. The wood grain patterns inside the sound chamber didn't match the external aging. More importantly, I found traces of modern synthetic materials in the binding adhesive, materials that weren't available in 1943. This wasn't just a restored vintage guitar. Someone had taken modern wood, aged it artificially, and created an entirely fake instrument using period-correct techniques and materials. Marcus stared at me for a long moment after I explained what I'd found. "You're telling me I paid $72,000 for a reproduction? I'm telling you that somebody built a very convincing fake using techniques and materials that would fool most people. The craftsmanship is actually impressive. This would have taken months to complete properly." And you think Fairchild Music knew? That was the million-dollar question. It was possible that Constance had been fooled by a sophisticated fake and was unknowingly selling reproductions as authentic vintage instruments. But given the volume of suspicious pieces that collectors had noticed, and the fact that she seemed to have an endless supply of instruments from the most collectible periods, the pattern looked deliberate. Marcus wanted to confront Constance immediately, but I suggested a more strategic approach. If we were dealing with systematic fraud rather than isolated incidents, we needed to understand the full scope before tipping her off. Over the next month, Marcus reached out to his collector network and identified 7 other instruments purchased from Fairchild Music that had raised questions among their owners. Using various pretexts, we managed to examine 4 of them. 3 showed the same patterns I'd found in Marcus's Martin. Modern materials disguised with artificial aging, grain patterns that didn't match their supposed production dates, and acoustic characteristics that weren't consistent with authentic vintage instruments. The 4th guitar was even more interesting. It was completely authentic, a genuine 1950s Gibson that had clearly been purchased from another collector and resold through Fairchild at a significant markup. This suggested that Constance was mixing authentic vintage pieces with sophisticated reproductions, using the legitimate guitars to provide cover for the fakes. By this point, I was convinced we were looking at a systematic fraud operation, but proving it would require evidence that would hold up in court, and that meant involving law enforcement. Here's something most people don't know about art and collectibles fraud. It's taken very seriously by federal authorities when the amounts involved reach certain thresholds. The FBI has specialized units that handle high-value fraud cases involving fake artwork, counterfeit luxury goods, and fraudulent collectibles. Marcus had contacts in the law enforcement community through his day job as a forensic accountant, and he agreed to make some preliminary inquiries about how we should proceed. Meanwhile, I continued documenting everything I could about Constance's business operations and the HOA harassment campaign. The connection between the 2 issues became clear when I received what turned out to be the final escalation in the HOA conflict. This time, Constance had apparently convinced the board to classify my workshop as a manufacturing facility that required the same permits and inspections as a commercial business. The violation notice demanded that I either obtain a commercial operating license, which would be impossible in a residential zone, or cease all manufacturing activities immediately. The fines had escalated to $500 per day, and the notice included a threat to place a lien on my property if the violations weren't corrected within 10 days. More ominously, the notice mentioned that the HOA was investigating potential code violations related to the storage and sale of valuable goods without proper security measures. That last part was clearly a reference to the instruments I was building and the occasional client visits to my workshop, but it also suggested that Constance was fishing for information about my business relationships and client base. I was starting to think she saw my workshop as a potential threat to her fraud operation in multiple ways. Not only was I attracting the kind of experts who might notice authentication problems, but I was also building relationships with collectors who might start asking questions about instruments they'd purchased from Fairchild Music. The solution, from her perspective, was to drive me out of the neighborhood before I could become a problem. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd escalated the HOA conflict to the point where it was starting to look like harassment, which gave me legal options I hadn't had before. I hired a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, and together we started building a case that the violation notices and fines represented selective enforcement aimed at driving me out of the community for reasons unrelated to legitimate community standards. The attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Gonzalez who'd handled dozens of similar cases, immediately spotted the inconsistencies in how the HOA was treating my business compared to other home-based operations in the neighborhood. "This looks like targeted harassment," she told me after reviewing the documentation. "The question is why someone would go to such lengths to get rid of a guitar maker. There has to be an underlying business interest." When I explained what we'd discovered about the authentication issues with Fairchild Music instruments, Patricia's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine concern. "If you're right about systematic fraud, then this HOA conflict could be part of a much larger criminal conspiracy. The amounts you're talking about would definitely qualify for federal prosecution." She suggested that we coordinate with Marcus's law enforcement contacts to ensure that any actions we took in the HOA dispute wouldn't interfere with a potential fraud investigation. That coordination led to a meeting with Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's art crime team, and that's when things got serious very quickly. Agent Walsh had been tracking suspicious activity in the vintage instrument market for several months as part of a broader investigation into counterfeit luxury goods. When we showed her the evidence we'd collected about Fairchild Music, she immediately recognized patterns that matched other cases her team was working. The luxury collectibles market has become a major target for sophisticated fraud operations, she explained. The profit margins are enormous, the authentication processes are often subjective, and victims are reluctant to come forward because it's embarrassing to admit you've been fooled. More importantly, she told us that Fairchild Music was already on their radar. Several insurance companies had filed suspicious activity reports related to claims involving instruments purchased from Constance's stores, and there had been complaints from collectors in other states about authentication issues. "What you've provided gives us the technical evidence we need to move forward with a formal investigation," Agent Walsh said, "but we're going to need your cooperation to gather additional proof." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. I would continue my normal business operations while documenting any attempts by Constance to interfere with my work or gather information about my clients. Meanwhile, Marcus would pose as a serious collector interested in purchasing multiple high-value instruments from Fairchild Music. The idea was to create a controlled environment where we could document Constance's sales practices and potentially catch her in the act of knowingly selling fraudulent instruments. But first, we had to deal with the immediate HOA crisis. The 10-day deadline for correcting the manufacturing facility violation was approaching, and Patricia advised me that I needed to respond before Constance could file the property lien. Her strategy was to demand a formal hearing before the full HOA board, where we could present evidence of selective enforcement and harassment. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in early December, and I spent the week before preparing documentation that would demonstrate the inconsistent application of HOA rules. I had photographs of other home businesses operating in the neighborhood without restrictions, noise measurements showing that my workshop was quieter than several neighbors' air conditioning units, professional inspections confirming that my operation met all safety and environmental standards. But most importantly, I had evidence suggesting that the violation notices were motivated by factors unrelated to legitimate community concerns. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. When Patricia presented our evidence to the full 5-member board, 3 of the members immediately expressed serious concerns about how the violations had been handled. Board member Janet Morrison was particularly pointed in her questions to Constance. "I've reviewed the complaint file, and I can't find any documentation of actual noise disturbances or safety issues. The fire marshal and OSHA have both signed off on Mr. Kimberly's operation. What exactly are we trying to accomplish here?" Constance's response was telling. Instead of addressing the specific violations, she focused on broader community concerns about commercial activities that might attract undesirable attention to the neighborhood. "We have to consider the precedent we're setting," she argued. "If we allow unrestricted business operations, property values could be affected." Board member Tom Chen, who ran his own home studio, wasn't buying it. "Constance, I've been operating a recording business out of my garage for 3 years without any complaints. Mr. Kimberly's workshop is actually quieter than my operation, and he has fewer client visits. How do you justify treating his business differently?" The vote to dismiss all violations was 4-1, with only Constance dissenting. The board also voted to refund the accumulated fines and formally apologize for the administrative errors in how my case had been handled. Outside the meeting, Constance approached me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No hard feelings, I hope," she said. "Sometimes these community issues get complicated. Maybe we can discuss that business partnership I mentioned when we first met." I smiled back and told her I'd consider it. What I didn't mention was that Agent Walsh was recording the conversation through a wire I was wearing. Over the next 6 weeks, the FBI investigation moved into high gear. Marcus made contact with Fairchild Music as a potential customer, expressing interest in building a collection of pre-war Martin guitars. Constance took the bait immediately, inviting him to view some exceptional pieces that weren't advertised publicly. The instruments she showed him were impressive: a 1936 Martin D28, a 1940 Martin Bergadur 0045, and a 1942 Martin D18 that she claimed had belonged to a famous musician whose name I won't mention for legal reasons. The total value, according to Constance, was just over $400,000. Marcus expressed serious interest, but requested authentication documents before making any purchases. Constance provided detailed provenance paperwork, including what appeared to be factory documentation and previous ownership records. When Marcus brought photos and documentation to me for unofficial verification, I immediately spotted problems. The serial number on the 1942 D18 didn't match Martin factory records for that year. The wood grain patterns on the 1936 D28 were inconsistent with documented construction techniques from that period. Most tellingly, the previous ownership records referenced a music store that hadn't existed until 1955. Agent Walsh's team ran the serial numbers through a federal database that tracks stolen and fraudulent collectibles. 2 of the 3 guitars matched instruments that had been reported as suspicious by insurance companies in other states. But the real breakthrough came when we arranged for Marcus to express interest in purchasing all 3 instruments, contingent on a technical inspection by his expert, meaning me. Constance agreed to the inspection, apparently confident that her forgeries were sophisticated enough to pass casual scrutiny. What she didn't know was that I'd be using FBI-provided recording equipment to document every detail of the authentication process. The inspection took place at Fairchild Music's flagship store in Nashville on a Saturday morning in January. Constance had arranged for us to use a private room normally reserved for high-value transactions, complete with professional lighting and examination equipment. Walking into that room was like entering a museum. The walls were lined with instruments that represented the holy grail of guitar collecting: pre-war Martins, vintage Gibsons, rare mandolins, and banjos that most people only saw in photographs. But knowing what I now knew about authentication, I found myself looking at that collection with different eyes. How many of these beautiful instruments were sophisticated reproductions? How many collectors had been convinced to pay premium prices for elaborate fakes? The technical inspection was revealing in ways that went beyond the specific instruments Marcus was considering. As I examined the 1942 D18, Constance made several comments that seemed designed to discourage too much scrutiny. "You know, some collectors get overly focused on minor details," she said as I was examining the interior construction. "These instruments are 80 years old. You have to expect some variation from factory specifications." When I pointed out that the bracing pattern didn't match documented Martin construction techniques from 1942, she had a ready explanation. Martin experimented with different bracing patterns during the war years because of material shortages. Some of those variations aren't well documented in the literature. Her explanations were plausible enough that they might have satisfied a collector who didn't have my technical background, but they also revealed a sophisticated understanding of how to deflect authentication concerns without outright lying. The real smoking gun came when I used my portable spectrum analyzer to measure the acoustic characteristics of all 3 instruments. The frequency response patterns were so similar that they were almost certainly built by the same person using the same techniques and materials. For authentic vintage instruments from different years and models, you'd expect significant variation in acoustic characteristics due to differences in wood aging, construction techniques, and design evolution. Finding 3 instruments with nearly identical sonic signatures was like finding 3 supposedly different fingerprints that were actually the same. When I shared this information with Marcus during a brief break, he made a decision that would blow the case wide open. "I'd like to purchase all 3 instruments," he told Constance when we returned to the examination room, "but given the investment level, I'll need to arrange insurance and transport through a specialized carrier. Can you provide detailed documentation for the insurance company?" Constance's expression flickered for just a moment, the kind of micro-expression that suggested she was calculating risks and benefits. But her smile returned quickly. "Of course, I'll have complete documentation packets prepared within a few days. Authentication certificates, provenance records, previous appraisal documents, everything your insurance company might need." What she didn't realize was that she'd just agreed to provide fraudulent documentation to facilitate a federal law enforcement operation. Under federal fraud statutes, that crossed the line from potentially innocent mistakes to deliberate criminal conspiracy. The documentation Constance provided was impressive in its thoroughness and completely fraudulent in its details. Forged appraisal documents, fake historical records, authentication certificates from experts who either didn't exist or had never examined the instruments in question. But the most damaging evidence came when Agent Walsh's team traced the actual origins of the instruments through wood analysis and construction techniques. Remember, I'd mentioned that each guitar has a sonic fingerprint determined by wood characteristics. What I hadn't mentioned was that modern forensic techniques can determine not just wood species, but the approximate age of the timber and even the geographical region where it was harvested. The analysis revealed that all 3 instruments had been constructed using wood that was harvested within the last 5 years, primarily from tree farms in the Pacific Northwest. The aging had been accomplished through chemical treatment and artificial environmental exposure, sophisticated techniques that would fool visual inspection but couldn't hide the fundamental characteristics of young wood. More damaging still was the discovery that the construction techniques matched instruments being produced by a workshop in China that specialized in creating reproductions for the film industry. Apparently, Constance had established a relationship with this workshop to produce vintage instruments that could pass casual authentication. The scope of the operation was staggering. FBI analysis of Fairchild Music's records revealed over 300 suspicious transactions over the past 4 years, with a total value exceeding $8 million. Constance had been importing reproduction instruments for approximately $3,000 each and selling them as authentic vintage pieces for $50,000 to $200,000 a piece. But the investigation also revealed something else. Constance had been systematically targeting potential threats to her operation. A search warrant for her business and personal records uncovered a detailed file on my workshop and client relationships. She'd been monitoring my social media, tracking my professional connections, and even photographing visitors to my home. More disturbing were records showing that I wasn't the first expert who'd attracted her attention. 2 other guitar makers in the region had faced sudden HOA problems or zoning issues after establishing relationships with collectors who might have discovered authentication problems with Fairchild Music instruments. One had been forced to relocate his workshop after his HOA suddenly decided that his business violated community standards. Another had faced a city zoning challenge that forced him to cease operations for 6 months while fighting the decision in court. Agent Walsh called it a defensive fraud strategy. Constance was using her HOA position and community connections to neutralize potential threats before they could expose her operation. The federal indictment was unsealed on a Wednesday morning in March, and by that afternoon, Constance Fairchild's world had completely collapsed. FBI agents simultaneously executed search warrants at all 3 Fairchild Music locations, her home in Harmony Estates, and a warehouse facility where she'd been storing inventory. The local news coverage was extensive, with reporters describing one of the largest vintage instrument fraud cases in federal history. Constance was arrested at her flagship store while trying to delete computer records that documented her relationships with the Chinese workshop. The charges included wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of federal trademark laws. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Agent Walsh called to tell me about Constance's first statement to investigators. Apparently, her attorney had tried to argue that she'd been fooled by sophisticated reproductions and hadn't known she was selling fraudulent instruments. But when agents showed her the surveillance recordings of our conversations, including her admission that she'd been monitoring my workshop to protect her business interests, that defense became untenable. The recordings clearly showed that she understood the authentication issues and had been deliberately targeting potential threats to her operation. Within days of the arrest, Fairchild Music's business empire began unraveling. Insurance companies started filing claims related to fraudulent instruments they'd covered. Collectors who'd purchased expensive guitars began demanding refunds. The 3 store locations were closed pending civil asset forfeiture proceedings. More importantly, collectors across the country started coming forward with instruments they'd purchased from Fairchild Music over the years. The FBI estimated that the full scope of victim losses could exceed $15 million when all claims were processed. The civil lawsuits followed quickly. Marcus filed the first class action suit on behalf of defrauded collectors, seeking full restitution, plus punitive damages. Additional lawsuits targeted the insurance companies that had covered fraudulent instruments and the Chinese workshop that had knowingly produced reproductions for fraudulent purposes. But for me, the most satisfying outcome was much simpler. The HOA board unanimously voted to remove Constance from her position and formally apologized for the administrative errors that had allowed her to abuse her authority. The Architectural Review Committee was restructured to prevent any single member from having unilateral power over violation notices. More importantly, I was finally free to focus on what I'd always wanted to do: build beautiful instruments in my workshop without harassment or interference. The story made national news when Constance was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $12.7 million in restitution to victims. The Chinese workshop was shut down by authorities there after pressure from U.S. law enforcement, and several other vintage instrument dealers were investigated for similar fraud schemes. But the real victory was seeing how the music community rallied around the victims. Several well-known artists donated instruments to benefit auctions that helped collectors recover their losses. Guitar manufacturers offered trade-in programs for people who'd been stuck with expensive reproductions. As for my workshop, business has never been better. Word spread through the collector community about my role in exposing the fraud, and I've become the go-to expert for authentication services. I now have a 2-year waiting list for custom instruments, and collectors regularly fly in from around the world just to have me examine potential purchases. The irony isn't lost on me that Constance's attempts to shut down my workshop actually ended up establishing my reputation as one of the most trusted voices in vintage instrument authentication. I still think about my grandfather sometimes when I'm working late in the shop, carving his initials into the hidden spot inside each new guitar I complete. He taught me that honest craftsmanship always wins in the end, even when it takes longer than you'd like. The basement workshop that Constance tried so hard to shut down is now featured in woodworking magazines and has become a destination for other guitar makers who want to learn advanced acoustic analysis techniques. I've started teaching weekend workshops for collectors who want to understand authentication better, sharing the technical knowledge that helped expose the fraud. So here's my question for all of you watching. Have you ever dealt with someone who used their position of authority to protect their own interests at your expense? Whether it's an HOA board member, a local official, or just someone with more power than they deserve, I'd love to hear your stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you enjoyed this story about how technical expertise can triumph over corruption, you'll want to stay tuned for next week's episode. I'll be telling you about a software engineer who discovered that his HOA board was embezzling community funds through a fake landscaping company, and how he used his coding skills to expose a $250,000 fraud scheme that sent 3 people to prison. The sound of justice, it turns out, is a lot like the perfect acoustic guitar. It takes patience, precision, and the right tools to create something beautiful that will resonate for years to come.